I'm Kari Borne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we partner with Fairhaven Senior Services to offer the Fairhaven Lecture Series. We've been doing so since 1983, so we're happy to be back this year. This year we're talking about remarkable women, and we're going to hear about some remarkable artists today from Ashley Dimmig. She is the Crossman Gallery Director at UW-Whitewater. In addition to overseeing all operations at the Crossman Gallery and its permanent art collection, she also teaches art history in the Department of Art and Design. After completing her PhD in the history of art at the University of Michigan in 2019, she worked as the interim curator of Islamic art at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. Her fields of specialization include the art and architecture of the Islamic world, particularly Turkish and Persian spheres during the early modern and modern periods. With a fine arts background in fiber arts and weaving, Dimmig is especially interested in textiles across the Islamic world. She has served on a number of professional boards and published in various scholarly journals and edited volumes, and she has been the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including residencies at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and at the Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations in Istanbul, and was recently awarded the Historians of Islamic Art Association Graybar Postdoctoral Fellowship to conduct research in Istanbul this summer, 2025, for her book project. Dimmig also holds 2 Master of Art degrees from Indiana University Bloomington and Koç University in Istanbul, as well as a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the Kansas City Art Institute. Welcome, Ashley Dimmig.
Thank you, Kari. Thank you for having me back. This is my 3rd year at UW-Whitewater and my 3rd year participating in this lecture series. So I'll keep coming as long as you keep inviting me back. So welcome. Happy to talk with you all today. My lecture today is different. The last couple times I've been here, I have focused more on my specific sub-genre of art history, like Islamic textiles or Ottoman tents, if you were here a couple years ago. Today is a little more of a survey, looking at a number of spectacular women artists. I'll begin with the title of this lecture, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? The provocative title is actually the same as one by Linda Nochlin, published in 1971 in Art News, one of the kind of oldest, most widely distributed art magazines in the world. So in the heart of second wave feminism, Linda Nochlin kind of upended a lot of what we think of in art history by asking this question and answering it in really dynamic ways. And typically I make my students suss that out, but I'll give you kind of the answer to the question at the outset here. She essentially says that by asking the question at all, we are admitting that there have been no great women artists. And for those of us who want to say, oh no, but there's so-and-so and so-and-so, we're already kind of falling into this trap of kind of being duped by the question at the outset, if that makes sense. The takeaway for her is really that historically, women have not been allowed to become great artists because greatness has been defined through male attributes, male accomplishments on the one hand, but also just simply they've been barred from things like access to nude models or access to art education, things like this. We'll see there have been some very rare exceptions to that rule. And I will say that, again, while kind of actually outside of my area of expertise, we'll be talking really exclusively about Western art today. So art from Europe and America, not the Islamic world. I was going to try to make it global and it became unwieldy. So I need to focus it a little bit. So Linda Nochlin was maybe the first, but not the last to ask such questions, right? Here we have an example by the Guerrilla Girls in the 1980s, very consciously citing this painting, this 19th century Orientalist painting by Ang. Again, so do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Less than 5% of artists in the modern art section are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. Now, female nude is, of course, a subject matter in art by women and men alike, and we'll look at some examples of that here today. And I will just, as a side note, So 2020, if you can think back to prior to the pandemic, shutting the world down, was supposed to be the year of the woman. We were at the 100-year anniversary of, voting, of women's suffrage. And in the museum world, we were talking about, and this is when I was working in Baltimore at the time, we were talking about how do we do this? How do we honor women artists? How do we start to shift these numbers, right? And it's hard to do all at once because you can't just throw away half your collection and, spend $1 billion to buy art by women artists. And in Baltimore, our rival museum had said, we're going to purchase this whole year, we're going to only purchase art by women artists. Well, one, the art that they did buy, they paid less for because the artists were women. And they changed the needle in terms of numbers. I think it was 0.4%. So they got a lot of very positive press for this dynamic kind of headline catching, we're only acquiring women artists. But when you look at the depth of this problem in the museum world, in the art world, in art history as such, it takes a lot. It's going to take a lot more time and effort to bring women artists like the ones we're going to talk about today to light in the proper way, and pave the way for women artists moving forward to be recognized as great. So the way that I'm going to answer this question is threefold. First, to talk about much more ancient art than I typically do, that the vast majority of women artists were often anonymous. And anonymous is not a great term here. Personally, they were unnamed. They were unrecognized. They were not able to sign their work. And we'll look at that, at why. Then we'll look at several women who were just born lucky enough to beat the system that was designed for men, meaning they were born wealthy, white, typically, with connections in the art world, and they therefore were able to kind of be those exceptions that we talk about. And then lastly, we'll talk about a few who had even more odds stacked against them in terms of race and status in society, as well as being women, who were able to beat the odds still further. But that by that token, there are fewer of them still because of how much was holding them back historically. So we'll be really looking up to about 1900 today. We'll leave the last century alone. And this quote is one we often say in the museum world as well. Anonymous was probably a woman. Even in the last century, we see publications written by men. What we know that their wives, for example, were taking down all the notes and editing and doing all the work behind the scenes without credit. But keep an eye out. We'll acknowledge Virginia Woolf again here in a little bit. Going as far back in time as we can, here we're looking at a representation, actually, what is widely recognized to be the earliest representation of a human figure in art made by human hands. There are some prior to this that are disputed, or some prior to this that are of animals, but this is the earliest human figure that we have that comes down to us, carved out of mammoth ivory. And indeed, I think it is relatively obvious that this figure is indeed a woman. Now, this object and those like it discovered in Neolithic Europe were deemed Venuses by the archaeologists who uncovered them typically in the 19th century. This is kind of a catch-all term. It's a misnomer. Venus, that we know as the Roman goddess, did not exist yet for another tens of thousands of years. But the archaeologists who found them said that these must be Venuses because they seem to represent fertility or love or something to that effect. So this is a kind of a catch-all term meaning a fertility goddess, which in terms of art historical analysis, looking at enlarged breasts, visible genitalia, that is very possibly true, right? And here's a nice little handheld one for scale here. Perhaps the most famous of these Venus figures, the Venus of Willendorf, discovered in Austria in the early 20th century. Here we have still further, now we have a different material here, limestone, but further articulated, or maybe just survived better in terms of the representation. There is no face, but we have what we believe to be some kind of representation of hair or headgear of some kind. Now, again, the archaeologists archaeologists who uncovered these were predominantly men because of the time period we're talking about. So the assumption was always that the men were going to be the ones doing these things, right? They were the ones achieving greatness, as it were, nodding back to Linda Nochlin. But as more and more people studied these objects, and again, she's just quite handheld as well here, and this image really shows that these were not statuettes to be stood on something. They were likely carried, because indeed, we're talking about nomadic people at this time. So the function was still questioned, and likely, again, sort of the best guess we have is that they would have been sort of talismanic, carried around. But the question of their makers was somewhat solved when female scholars started thinking more about these and looking at these from a different perspective, both literally and figuratively. And here, if you're looking down from the perspective of the figure itself, we see a different kind of a different perspective. So whereas on the left here, looking at the figure straight on, the proportions seem maybe a little exaggerated or off. But when you're looking at it from the perspective of the figure itself, it seems as though this could be a self-representation of a woman carving how she sees her pregnant belly from the view from above. So scholars now believe that these were largely carved by women and carried by and for women in terms of enabling a healthy childbirth, which of course would have been of the utmost importance then as it is now. Jumping ahead several hundred thousand or several tens of thousands of years, another example of highly underappreciated, unrecognized art are things like this, not just kind of crafts of all kinds, ceramics, but of course textiles being the one I have my personal affinity with. Here we're looking at an image of the installation of the Bayeux Tapestry, which is not a tapestry, it is an embroidery, an extraordinarily large embroidery, about 20 inches high and 230 feet long. I can't remember if that includes, there was some loss of it, but it quite survives really well intact. Now, the story behind this, I'll say, is highly detailed and scholars think is quite historically accurate. Oftentimes we tell stories generations after the fact, in art or otherwise, and we'll see some cases of that here today. But this tapestry was commissioned within a few years of the events happening. So this was still within living memory, and therefore the artists were able to capture some significant historical detail. And indeed, this remains one of the best documents we have to understand the Battle of Hastings in 1066. The story behind it is, I'll try to keep it brief. The King of England was he had no children. He was trying to name his heir, which was his cousin, William of Normandy, just across the English Channel. Now, he sends his brother-in-law, Harold, to go tell William, hey, you're going to have to be king after me. But when Edward dies, Harold takes the throne for himself. Then William the Conqueror has to conquer the kingdom that was meant to be his in the first place. This is where William gets the title, William the Conqueror. So he indeed is victorious, and ultimately we have the death of Harold. This is also one of the earliest representations of Halley's Comet we have in art, which is just an interesting aside. But we see here a narrative unfolding both visually and textually, and we have margins that feature historical events, as well as kind of side stories, side plots, or even allusions to things like Aesop, like fairy tales or other kind of animal marginalia. But these are, again, we don't have the names of the artists, but it is almost assuredly a group of Anglo-Saxon women, specifically nuns, cloistered nuns. It was Otto, I can't remember what he was the Duke of, but he was another relative of William the Conqueror. He commissioned this to commemorate the events, and who were the greatest embroiderers of the time? Anglo-Saxon women. Also, just as an aside, if anyone's interested in Anglo-Saxon art, there's a great movie called The Dig. It's available on Netflix, I believe, about the discovery of the Sutton Hoo burial. It was this ship burial that completely upended the way that we think about Anglo-Saxon history and art. They were believed to not have art, but this massive discovery that unfolded kind of during World War II completely changed our understanding of Anglo-Saxon art. But that's just an aside. Now, acknowledging all of the women, hundreds, thousands, if not millions of women who have been artists unrecognized throughout the course of history, let's look at some of those exceptional cases. We'll begin in the north of Europe and move to the south of Europe, and then look into more into the early modern period. So here we're looking at a self-portrait by Judith Leyster. Judith Leyster was working in Holland as a painter because she... Was it something? Okay. Excuse me. She was born to a father who was a cloth merchant and a brewer. Now, in early modern Holland, that meant that she was upper middle class at the very least. This was the Dutch Golden Age, and we have the merchant class rising as an extraordinarily wealthy group of people, just kind of below what we might think of as a royal class. So an extraordinarily wealthy time period. And so she was born into privilege, and her father encouraged her to pursue the arts. So here we have her essentially self-advertising, portraying herself, painting a painting. And indeed, her subject matter was one that was deemed appropriate, or at least acceptable for a woman to paint at the time. This includes sort of genre scenes, meaning everyday life, in this case, merrymakers, or domestic scenes. These were kind of subjects that, again, were deemed acceptable. She, like many of the others we will see, her talents were recognized at an early age, and she was able to be working for pay as early as the age of 19, which is pretty extraordinary. However, after her death, she kind of fell into obscurity because history is written again, largely by men. And so who defines greatness, who gets to decide is in the history books, were often men. And especially, as a lot of my students will know, Giorgio Vasari was kind of the first to do this, at least in the European context. He was writing, and we'll see his writing here in a minute. He dedicated a significant amount of pages of his book to Michelangelo in particular, but he wrote the book literally kind of the lives of the great artists. And he did include one woman, as we'll see, but essentially she fell into obscurity because she was not studied. So she was making money in her time, but was only rediscovered about 100 years ago. Prior to that, the work that we have of her was attributed to a male that was working in the same time, place, and style, Franz Hals. Some think that maybe she apprenticed with him, but we don't have any documentation of that. It is known, though, that she took students of her own, which is also quite extraordinary or exceptional. Otherwise, if her paintings weren't attributed to Franz Hals, they were attributed to her husband, who at the time was the lesser of the painters in the family. But thankfully, 100 years ago, thanks to art historians doing some in-depth scholarship, we have recovered the legacy of Judith Leyster. Here's just a few details to recognize her distinct style, which I think is, Franz Hals is known for this kind of loose brushwork, but I think Judith Leyster takes it to another level. We could almost think of this as impressionist long before its time, indeed like 2.5 centuries before we have the Impressionists come onto the table. And here, just the glob of paint that is almost a glob of paint itself, this real thick impasto technique. A generation or two later, but in the same cultural context, so in the kind of the glory of the Dutch Golden Age, we have Rachel Ruysch, and she was lucky enough to never fall into obscurity. She may be the only exception to that rule, where her collections, even early collectors, were collecting Rachel Ruysch, which is why now many museums do at least have an example of her work. She worked pretty much exclusively with floral still lifes. Now, on the one hand, this was acceptable for women to paint flowers, right? But at the time, she was born to a professor of anatomy and botany. So she had unrestricted access to these materials that were privileged in art. So this is why I say some of these women have been sort of born into circumstances that allow kind of that perfect confluence of events to allow them to break out of the bounds of the art world, kind of keeping them down. Now, Rachel Ruysch and other still life painters like her, but she's really seen as the greatest among them, was known for these floral paintings, which is not just a still life. She's not just visually recording in absolutely minute detail. Unlike Judith Leister, you really can barely see her brushstrokes. It is so finely done in oil. But this is not just depiction of nature as she sees it. This is an intellectual pursuit. And by that, I mean she is studying each bloom individually and then composing them in a way that would have been impossible in the real world, meaning that these flowers don't bloom at the same time each year, nor are all of them from the same area. These are blooms from multiple different continents and multiple time periods of the year. So the only way these bouquets can exist is in her mind and then transferred to the canvas. And indeed, chief among these was the tulip. Now, you may associate kind of just in pop culture tulips with Holland. And yes, indeed, there was a massive tulip craze, though fun fact, they got it from the Ottoman Empire, who still celebrate the Tulip Festival every spring in Istanbul. But at the time, tulips were beyond expensive. A single tulip bulb would have garnered essentially an entire merchant's salary for the year, like a single bulb for an annual salary. And she is depicting 3 tulips. So this certainly would have been really for the highest class in terms of commissioning of a work, and would have spoke volumes to the people who would have seen these paintings. Like Judith Leister, she was also working for commissions at a very early age. Her father likewise encouraged her to pursue the arts, and she was apprenticed by the age of 15. So here again, we kind of have a child prodigy. Now, what is perhaps most extraordinary is that her work was garnering an extraordinary amount of money. At the time, I want to get this correct. So her floral paintings in the Dutch 17th century were worth more than 1,200 guilders, so the type of currency, whereas a history painting, which was the highest order, by Rembrandt, no one less than Rembrandt, was only 500 guilders. So she was already outperforming Rembrandt on the market at the time and place. But who of you has heard of Rembrandt and not Rachel Ruysch? Indeed. Thank you. And just a couple details here as well to just appreciate her extraordinary work. If you can ever see one of these in person, please do. They're transformative in a way that does not translate perfectly in a PowerPoint. Okay, so we're going to go back in time a little bit, but go to Southern Europe to look at a couple of Italian examples of extraordinary women artists. Here we have Sofonisba Anguissola, who, as we see here, is kind of, we're going to see a repeated theme of these self-portraits of women doing the act that they're sort of advertising for, right? That they're painting. But Sofonisba was the one to pilot this. She created multiple self-portraits of herself painting, which was virtually unheard of at the time, which we see with Judith Leister and more artists. This does become a theme. Here, Sofonisba, you may now be surprised to hear, was born into wealth with connections and was discovered at an early age and encouraged by her father. running theme here. And in fact, she at one point became a lady in waiting for the Queen of Spain. She worked for King Philip over there. But in the Renaissance, which is the time period we're looking at here, women were explicitly barred from apprenticing with master artists. However, there were sort of rumors that she was working with, or at least was known by, none other than Michelangelo. And indeed, she is the greatest exception of all in that she was referenced by Giorgio Vasari in his book on the great artists of the Renaissance. He says, and there's multiple quotes by him, but I'm giving you one for now, she has labored at the difficulties of design. Now, I'll stop there. This translation isn't perfect. This is the Italian disegno. And this is why the artist's genius becomes a whole thing in the Renaissance, because design is or disegno is this kind of intellectualization of art. You're not just a craftsman executing something with great skill. There is an intellect behind the artwork. And that is what design or disegno means in this context. So the fact that he's acknowledging her intellectual capabilities first and foremost here is extraordinary. So at the difficulties of design with greater study and better grace than any other woman of our time. And she has not only succeeded in drawing, coloring, and copying from nature, and in making excellent copies of works by other hands, a common way to study art at the time, but has also executed by herself alone some very choice and beautiful works of painting. To impress Vasari was no mean feat. Now, she, like many other women artists, there's an example of Michelangelo's painting. She, like many women artists of the Renaissance and early modern period more broadly, was limited in terms of the scope of her subject matter. She, too, worked primarily with domestic scenes, and here we do have an example of that. And this painting in particular was called out by Vasari, saying that it was done with such diligence and facility that the figures appear alive and that the only thing missing is speech. Now, these are her sisters, and their handmaiden in the corner. She was the first of 7 children. The second born was a son. He is not here, but the 3 daughters, 4 daughters, including Sofonisba herself. So really, she's the eldest born daughter. The next born daughter is looking at her, the artist, and you can kind of, if you have sisters, you can kind of maybe clock the dynamic here of them sort of looking to each other, but challenging each other at the game of chess. And indeed, so this is Sofonisba really kind of articulating the fact that she and her sisters are well-read, well-educated, and pursuing intellectual pursuits, painting and, in this case, chess. Now, Artemisia Gentileschi is perhaps one of my favorite. Of course, I have favorites, right? We can't, be neutral all the time. Moving ahead in time, nearly a century, but still in the Italian peninsula, Artemisia Gentileschi was coming to the fore at a time in the Baroque period, if we're looking at artistic periodization, and working with the artist Caravaggio, who at the time was world-renowned more than any other. Maybe Rembrandt could have rivaled him, but essentially there were groups of artists around Europe who called themselves the Caravaggisti, essentially followers of Caravaggio, who worked in his style, who wanted to resemble his work. So she was working with the greatest painter, essentially, of the age. Now, it might surprise you to hear that she was a daughter of an artist her father was an artist. He encouraged her. He recognized her talents at a very young age. And she was working, not just apprenticed as a teenager, but was working for pay as early as 15 years old. She is exceptional beyond exceptional because she was painting subjects not deemed appropriate for women, not just flowers or still lives or genre scenes or domestic scenes, but what we call history painting. This is again sort of coined by Vasari, but meaning works that reflect not just history, but great moments in mythology. And again, thinking in terms of the greatest sort of intellectual representation of mankind, as it were. So here we see yet another self-portrait, but unlike the others, we don't actually see what she's painting. We're focused on her and her alone. And unlike the others, she's not looking at us, the audience. She is completely engrossed in her work and was deemed a very serious, dedicated artist. And we see that reflected in her work. Now I'm going to look at a comparison of two paintings of the same subject by Caravaggio, her teacher, and by Artemisia herself. So this is an example of a history painting. This is depicting a biblical story of Judith and Holofernes. Judith, this young woman, her town, her village, was besieged by the Assyrian army led by General Holofernes. And so the story goes, she uses her feminine wiles to infiltrate the camp, infiltrate Holofernes' tent, and behead him in his sleep. And thereby essentially saving her village. So it's a story of great heroism from the Bible. And here we have Caravaggio. This is distinctly Caravaggio. We have this extreme light and dark shading happening here. So the bright, bright whites, dark, dark blacks. Though in terms of the action here, what we see at center is a young woman who seemingly is hesitating mid-stroke, mid-sword swipe here, right? And yet the violence that the figure is experiencing with this wild spurting blood seems discordant with her own movements, right? And then we have kind of her handmaiden in the corner looking rather devilish and encouraging her, like I think some of my students have said, like the devil on your shoulder, kind of encouraging her in the act. But the figure, the protagonist herself here seems almost hesitant or disgusted. Fun sidebar, somebody somewhere thought this would be a great image for a marinara sauce label. And I can't imagine that was a mistake. Like some art history major in the marketing team had to think that this was hilarious. And indeed, it is. So looking at Artemisia's version of the same story, we have quite a different tale told here. Now, to understand Artemisia's approach to this subject matter, we have to understand more about her biography. When she was a teenager, already working in the art world, there was an artist, not her father, but an artist, and not Caravaggio as well, but another artist she was training with, who was supposed to be her teacher, sexually assaulted her. Now, thankfully, they did try him, and we have all the court documents of this. She testified on her own behalf, which was extraordinarily brave. They did convict him of said assault, and his punishment was exile, but it was never enforced. So essentially, there was no punishment for this violent assault on Artemisia. She processed her emotions through her art. And so she actually was specifically drawn to scenes and history painting and biblical stories that show women in power and women kind of fighting back or fighting for themselves. So indeed, Judith and Holofernes here fit the bill for her, as it were. And then in knowing that background story, it may not surprise you that this figure here, Judith, was thought to be, or is thought to be, a self-portrait by Artemisia, and that this figure, Holofernes, bears a striking resemblance to her attacker, who never received justice, though in this case, at least in the painting, he did. So she's using this to, I think, process her own emotions. And scholars have pointed out that unlike this hesitant young maiden, she is quite determined and is actually much more gruesome in the reality of the way that, so even blood spatter analysts have looked at this and determined that this is an accurate portrayal of a beheading. And the handmaiden indeed quite helping along in this case as well. So there they are side by side. Yeah, it's a striking difference, even though stylistically we definitely see that Caravaggio influence with the light and dark composition, dramatic movements, angles, all of that stuff, but a different tale told. So moving forward into the 18th century, we'll look at a little lighter subject matter for a minute. Here we have yet another self-portrait of Elisabeth Louise Vigée Le Brun. She was perhaps less well connected than some of the other European female artists we've seen, but she was the daughter of an artist, just a minor one, who did foster her interest in the art and who did recognize her talent at an early age. Now, I repeat this for a number of reasons. One, it could be true, but two, this is actually kind of a trope begun by Vasari himself, that the way you recognize greatness in an artist is that they were recognized as a prodigy before they ever had training. And this kind of feeds into the narrative of the inborn artist genius. And so that these women, that their tales are told in a very similar fashion, actually kind of subverts that kind of male-centric definition of greatness. So but also it could very well be true as well. Being born well-connected and daughter of an artist will probably help your artistic career. So her talent was recognized at an early age, and she was taking commissions by the age of 15. And at some point in her early career, a random duchess of the court of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette kind of threw her a bone and was like, "Oh, sure, you can paint my portrait, to help this, young up and coming artist." And then she was absolutely blown away by it. And indeed, Le Brun was known for her charms, that she was able to put her sitters at complete ease and then reflect that in the paintings, that they were not just idealized, but that she made the people feel like their best selves to then portray that. And so after that amazing commission by the sort of random duchess, that duchess recommended Elizabeth to none other than Marie Antoinette. And indeed, just to kind of hammer home that point of the self-portraits becoming a thing. And this is the very first portrait that Vigée Le Brun painted of Marie Antoinette. And this is a very classic representation of Marie Antoinette with kind of no expense spared. The painting is first of all enormous, so 107.5 inches tall. It was actually made for her mother in Austria, which is why it's in Vienna today. But her mother just absolutely adored the painting, and I believe even that Marie Antoinette then had one made for herself as well. She's shown here wearing, of course, the latest fashions of the day, including the great hair poof, which is almost infamous at this point, surrounded by the luxury of Versailles. Now, Vigée Le Brun, continued to work for Marie Antoinette until her death. Vigée Le Brun did have to kind of go out and leave the country for several decades. I think she did end up returning to France later in her life, and she continued painting throughout the rest of her life. But in the decade or so between this painting and this one, the political situation in France was deteriorating significantly. And so what we see here on the left is a very different representation, again, still by Vigée Le Brun, of Marie Antoinette. This was after a bit of a scandal, but, Marie Antoinette was well steeped in many scandals, though this one in particular wasn't necessarily her fault, but all to come back to how the crown was overspending and the people didn't have a scrap of bread to eat, right? We all know.
Of battery, can I swap you this one? Do you mind holding it? It'll be all right. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
I'm glad you caught it.
Yeah. All right. Can you hear me? Do I need to be closer or farther away? Okay. So here we have on the left a painting commissioned by Louis XVI, where the point was to portray Marie Antoinette as a much more sympathetic character. She's wearing far fewer frills, far less jewelry, and she's seated around her children, or her children are around her, right? Not only that, do we have her eldest daughter and the prince on the far right, the dauphin, the heir. He is holding up a curtain to look into an empty cradle. And this was painted, actually. When the painting began, there had been a fourth child who passed away during the course of painting. And rather than completely eliminating the cradle from the scene, they left it in and showed the empty cradle, again, to have the public sympathize with Marie Antoinette as a mother like any other in that way, who would, especially in the time period, have suffered losses. I think, as we all know, this didn't work very well. And indeed, Vigée Le Brun did not want this painting shown publicly for fear of somebody vandalizing it. It was like that. We were at that level. But they did. They kind of forced her to show it, and but to mixed reviews. And as we know, Marie and Louis were beheaded shortly thereafter. So there's just the date on that. I'm going to try to move a little faster so we have time for questions. So I'll breeze through Rosa Bonheur a little bit here. So moving into the 19th century now, Rosa Bonheur was exceptional for the fact that she was living more or less out as a queer woman in the 19th century. Now, she never explicitly said the term lesbian or any equivalent thereof of the time, but she dressed in men's clothes. She was not painted in men's clothes, but she dressed in men's clothes. What did they say? She was a chain smoker and wore her hair short, which were all kind of the ways in which lesbians, without having to say so at the time, would be able to identify themselves within the sort of subculture of 19th century France. Now, she was never accepted into the Académie des Beaux-Arts, which is, again, something women would have been barred from. But she did receive commissions from the French government. And in fact, what we're looking at here is a portrait of her painted by a different artist, but she painted the cow, and that's what she was known for above all else. She was an animal painter, and painted, this was one of the pieces commissioned by the French government to portray France as prosperous, kind of on the dawn of a new day, able to survive the winter. We have here a beautiful countryside scene with hard workers and healthy animals and plowing fields, right, to kind of paint this picture of a prosperous country. She received great acclaim for this, and then started receiving international commissions. This is when I think she even met Queen Victoria. She was really internationally known. Sort of, again, despite being, in this case, potentially having her sexual orientation be held against her, because, of course, at the time, gender expression of that regard would have been explicitly outlawed and punishable by law. But she thrived. Oh man, I forgot how many of these artists I included here. I want to get to the last two. Julia Margaret Cameron, likewise, we're talking about sort of the Victorian era at this time period. I included her as a photographer rather than a painter. And here we see her own quote talking about the moment when she received her camera, which was at the age of 48. She had already raised her 6 children by this time, and began her artistic career quite late in life. She was an extraordinarily devout Christian, and a lot of her subject matter relates back to Christian and biblical stories, as well as sort of Victorian fairy tales. Here, we see a portrait of her niece, who actually then was the mother of Virginia Woolf. So cycling back to our quote from Virginia Woolf earlier. But she used anybody and everybody as her sitters. So kind of an Ethiopian prince to her niece, to using her husband as Merlin in telling the stories of, this was a commission by Lord Tennyson. She was rubbing, elbows with Lord Tennyson and Charles Darwin and all these great influential people of the day. Her house servant, what she used as the Virgin Mary, and a neighborhood kid as the Angel of the Nativity. She was especially known for these photographs of children as angels. And of course, at the time, again, even thinking back to Marie Antoinette here, childhood and even maternal mortality was a significant concern. And in the throes of kind of the spiritualist movement here, these portraits in particular were well renowned. And indeed, she was accepted quite openly by the community of artists, but other photographers didn't like her work. She used too much artistic license. They wanted the group of photographers at the time, which is this quite early in photographic history, were much more focused on detail and documentation. And she was like fairies and wings, like she was doing something quite different with her work. So just a comparison there with a Raphael painting. Yeah. Okay. If I can go on a little bit further here to give two final examples of women artists who, unlike the ones we've seen so far, had even more stacked against them in terms of becoming well-renowned artists. Angel Decora was a Ho-Chunk artist, though she's depicted here dressed in plains, like Great Plains garments. She was known especially for, and she was recognized talent at an early age. She was able to go to art school, but not before being kidnapped away from her culture and forced into a residential school. This was a system of schools that was in place as late as the 1970s, and more recently, mass graves of Indigenous children have been found. So this was a really horrible place where these schools were essentially designed to strip Native American children of their language and identity and culture. But Angel Decora came out of it and wanted to come back to her culture through the arts. Here we just have a portrait of her stepsister, I believe. Here's a photo of Angel painting in her studio. But she had a greatest affinity. Oh, another painting. This is actually a painting she made for a book illustration about a story of young Indian boys who were forced into these residential schools. So here her work is certainly reflecting her own biography as well. But this gets to the fact that her greatest affinity was really in graphic design. And this was, again, in the kind of early 1900s here. And she thought that graphic design was much more aligned with her like indigenous sensibilities, was kind of how she put it. And if you look at things like beadwork and thinking of working on a grid, I can totally see how that would have felt familiar to her. And indeed, she accepted a teaching position at a school. I'm going to read a quote by her here. Oh my. On the condition, quote, on the condition that she shall not be expected to teach in the white man's way, but shall be given complete liberty to develop the art of my own race and to apply this as far as possible to various forms of art, industries, and crafts, which she was indeed allowed to do. And here, this was a commission for a book where each chapter about various indigenous cultures was kind of framed by representations of various art forms of those cultures. Now we'll finish with Edmonia Lewis, who's just one of my favorite artists. Now she is, again, extraordinary for many reasons, not least of which was that she was also Afro-Indigenous. So her mother was a daughter of a formerly enslaved person and an Ojibwe. So her mother was Afro-Indigenous. Her father was Haitian, though she played down that side of her identity because at the time with the Haitian Revolution, Haitians were seen as dangerous. And so she was she was really raised by her mother's family among the Ojibwe. She became an orphan around age 8 and lived with her mother's family around the Niagara Falls region. And she and her brother actually were helping create crafts for sale to keep the family afloat. But her brother at one point then kind of went out for the gold rush and was able to pay for her education. So her brother struck it rich and she was off to Oberlin College, which was a fully integrated school at the time. So being not only African-American and Indigenous and a woman, she was accepted there. Well, with an asterisk, I'll say. I'm showing here just a comparison in terms of thinking of photography. This carte de visite, which is also the kind of form that we see here, Sojourner Truth saying, I sell the shadow to support the substance, meaning she sells photographs of herself to support the abolitionist movement. But Edmonia Lewis started her art education at Oberlin, or her formal art education at Oberlin. There was an unfortunate incident where, with her white female roommates, they were out on a carriage ride with some boys, which maybe they shouldn't have been. They were maybe drinking wine, which maybe they shouldn't have been. The next day, the girls said that they had been tricked and poisoned, and it was Edmonia's fault, and threw her under the bus, which, for all accounts, point to this was a complete fallacy. And she was then just kind of ostracized among the community. The art teacher started accusing her of stealing and these kinds of things. So she ended up leaving without her degree. But she moved to Boston, and there was able to start apprenticing with various artists, and she moved into the 3D medium, which is really where it was at. She started with ceramics and later became a marble sculptor, which is where she really flourished. And this was one of her early pieces of Robert Gould Shaw, who led one of the African-American regiments in the Civil War, and his family was blown away by her representation of him. And you can see that here vis-a-vis a photograph that she really captured his likeness. But even in Boston, she was not receiving a warm welcome into the community. And so she ultimately, her quote, the land of liberty had no room for a colored sculptor. So she got out of the States and went to Rome instead, where there was a bastion of American women sculptors who wanted to live near the source of Carrara marble. So that's where she found her community and where she continued to sculpt for decades thereafter. So she has carved sculptures of various subjects, here of Indigenous people, but really a representation of as a literary reference. But the one that I teach most often in my class is Forever Free, which is a representation of two formerly enslaved individuals, a man and a woman, upon hearing of their emancipation. Now, this I contrast with other representations of the same, though here's our signature down here, made in Rome. Other representations of kind of abolitionist movements in this case, and we'll kind of see what these have in common and what they don't, as well as this series. Now, before I get to that, I have several other examples when I teach this in class, but essentially Edmonia was showing the sort of self-determination of formerly enslaved peoples, whereas a lot of other artists at the time were showing Lincoln as the savior or showing people still in chains. So Edmonia was kind of flipping the script on that and depicting, again, as I say, sort of self-determination of newly emancipated individuals. Now, the wildest story, I do need my notes on this one because I just love this story. So here is what is now a very famous sculpture of the death of Cleopatra. And it was renowned at the time of its creation. She created it in Rome, shipped it over for the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. And it won awards there. It was highly renowned for depicting that moment when the life left the body of the ancient queen. Now, unfortunately, it didn't sell, even though it won awards. So it kind of traveled a little bit thereafter, and so then ended up in the exposition in Chicago in the following year. From there, the mystery thickens. It kind of goes into complete obscurity. Until at one point, somehow, it ended up outside a saloon on Clark Street, because it had been acquired, or then from there, it was acquired by a notorious gambler gangster who purchased it as a headstone for his beloved horse named Cleopatra. I know, it's amazing. I love this so much. From there, it stayed in Forest Park, Illinois for about a century, even after that racetrack where the horse was interred. That racetrack became a golf course and then a U.S. Postal Service distribution center until at one point, a local guy found it and brought it home to his son for a Boy Scout project. So the condition they found it in was closer to what we see on the right here. So they just got some paint from the local hardware store and just tried to fix it up as best they could. Of course, that ended up doing more damage than good, but you're fine. They didn't know what they had on their hands. I don't know how they moved the thing either. And then it fell into obscurity yet again until a scholar from this is Smithsonian American Art Museum in D.C. was like, this has to be somewhere. We have to find this world-renowned sculpture. And ended up finding it amongst the Christmas decorations in a mall storage area. I don't know how, but from there, and this was in the 90s, so from there, she recovered it, brought it back to DC, where it was properly restored to as best of its original condition as it could be, and she now lives on at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in DC. But it's just, I talk to my students not just about the biography of the artist, but about the biography of the art itself and all the lives that it lives, and this is one of the most extraordinary tales. So I will also say that she passed away while she was traveling in England of some kind of lung condition, I believe, in her 60s. And her grave was left a lot to be desired, let's say. But a GoFundMe page recently got her a fresh new headstone. She wanted to say sculptor and spinster, but they edited it just to be sculptor. And now she's living on an U.S. Post stamps as well as a Google Doodle and all kinds of ways. So her legacy has been recovered, but I always make sure to teach her amongst these extraordinary women artists. I think we have 3 minutes for questions. I'm sorry. Thank you.